podcast brought to you live from the Raptor Den Studios in Bellevue, Nebraska. We have a great show lined up for you today. We got TJ Roberts and Dr. Kyle Varner going to be talking to us about immigration. But first, I have a little plug to do.
That's right, Nathan. First, are you crypto curious?
Not at all, but I could be.
Well, if you're interested to know more about cryptocurrencies and how they might affect your life here in the future, well, Road to Freedom Foundation is hosting a crypto event here on October 27th in Omaha. Go to rtff.org for more information. And it is going to be R2FF. My apologies. R2FF.org, Road to Freedom Foundation. $65 gets you in. It's going to be an all-day event. Learn more about cryptocurrencies and how you can corner the market on Bitcoin.
Yes, and you can satisfy your crypto curiosity without a event. Remember, that's r2ff.org. $65 get in the door. Event takes place in Omaha, Nebraska. Now to our main event. All right, we have two guests today who I wanted to come on to talk about immigration, Lew Rockwell, the Mises Institute, and any other topic that pops into our heads that we decide to talk about. And remember, if you want to be a part of the conversation, leave a comment down below. And if Zach thinks it's good enough, he will pop a question for either us or our guests. Feel free to ask that question. So our first guest is one that you all know very well. He's been on the show, 4 times now, I believe?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Dr. Kyle Varner, the man who needs no introduction, but he does have a few new things going for him right now. He is the author of our upcoming book, White Coat Cartels. He will be able to tell you more about that later on in the broadcast. Also has a new website, drvarner.com. How you doing, Dr. Varner? It's like we talk to you every other week, it seems.
Well, thanks for having me. Talk to and insightful guys to talk to.
Awesome. All right, so our second guest hasn't been on the show before, but maybe we can make him a regular guest going forward in the future. He is TJ Roberts. He's the Director of Publications at the Liberty Institute for Freedom and Economics. LIFE, that's a very good acronym they got going there. He's also a contributor for the Ludwig von Mises Institute, a student at Transylvania University, and a grad of Mises University. How you doing, TJ?
Doing well, thank you for having me.
All right, so the reason that we decided to have these two fine gentlemen on the show today is because of an article written by one Lew Rockwell that was first published in 2015, but has been republished in this past month, called Open Borders Are an Assault on Private Property. And Dr. Varner had some very strong words to say about this article and about Lew Rockwell himself. So we decided to have Dr. Varner on to share his thoughts on the article, why he reacted the way he did, and any thoughts he may have. So why don't you lead us off, Dr. Varner?
All right. Well, to begin with, I owe Lew Rockwell an apology. And the reason I owe an apology is because I think how much and how deeply I disagree with him on the issue. And so I'm sorry for that. I shouldn't have. And the reason I did is because immigration is an issue that I feel very emotionally. I feel it very emotionally because I think it's one of the most aggravating ways that the state violates individual rights in the world. And when I see someone coming from a libertarian perspective or an anarcho-capitalist perspective and essentially defending the action of the state as something that is supportive of private property, I see that as very wrong-headed. And I actually also question whether that view is sincerely held. Probably not in Lew Rockwell's case. He probably sincerely holds his views. But a lot of people who purport to hold this view that immigration must be restricted for the sake of private property, or a slight of it, which is that, well, in an anarcho-capitalist society, since all borders are private land, they would somehow not have, there would somehow be a closed society or some tremendous difficulty in the movement of humans. I think both of these views are difficult to hold in good faith as a libertarian, although I'll admit that some do hold them. but they're outrageous views that I think are very, very mistaken. And I would take the exact opposite tact. I would argue stridently that open borders are essential to private property, and that your private property isn't yours if we don't have open borders.
All right, so before
we could get into. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so before we move on and allow TJ to respond, I want to read a little bit from the article itself. The 3 paragraphs in it I thought were probably the most important part of the article. It goes, and I quote, "Some libertarians have assumed that the correct libertarian position on immigration must be open borders, or the completely unrestricted movement of people. Superficially, this appears correct. Surely we believe in letting people go wherever they like. What we believe in are private property rights. No one has the freedom of speech on my property since I set the rules, and in the last resort, I can expel someone. He can say whatever he likes on his own property and on the property of anyone who cares to listen to him, but not on mine." Murray Rothbard noted, for instance, the large number of ethnic Russians whom Stalin settled in Estonia. This was not done so that Baltic people could enjoy the fruits of diversity. It never is. It is done in an attempt to destroy an existing culture, and in the process to make people more docile and less likely to cause problems for the Soviet Empire. Murray wondered, does libertarianism require me to support this, much less celebrate it? Or might there be more to the immigration question after all? So specifically, what about the argument that Lew Rockwell is making do you find most objectionable?
Well, I would say that what you just read there is a racist dog whistle. And it's a racist dog whistle because it is likening an action by Stalin of moving the ethnic Russians into Estonia to, and it's saying this very implicitly. It's talking about Hispanic immigration to the United States, and it's making specific reference to this argument that you hear from the radical right or from the alt-right that we are losing our culture. We are not losing our culture, and nor should the preservation of a culture be something the state uses violence to enforce. So I think that is a very objectionable sentiment.
Lost Dr. Varner. We'll try to get him back on.
Did you lose me?
Yeah, it seems like he just dropped out. So we're going to try to get him back on. So while we're trying to get him back on, I'll move on to TJ. And Dr. Varner was bringing up a good point about the article because the example he cited from Murray Rothbard doesn't seem to fit the argument he's trying to make, because he's using an example of forced immigration of Russians into the Baltic states, where that's not what's really happening in regards to immigration from the southern border. It's not that the United States is forcing Mexicans to move into the United States. It's that the United States is fairly prosperous and Mexico isn't, and there's a natural immigration going on there. So what would you say in response to that?
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start off by thanking Dr. Varner for his willingness to apologize. I'm going to explain why I feel as though that apology may be a slightly substandard based off of something that he said in this remark. But one of the first things that he points out is that he feels especially emotionally about immigration. I think we need to take that in mind whenever we're talking about this issue. When we are looking into libertarian philosophy, we have to consider the first thing is what will adhere to private property in the greatest sense. So we have to take our emotions out of this and think in a logical manner. But one of the big points to consider, it was the idea that when Rockwell was referring to Murray Rothbard's example in his article, Nations by Consent, the impetus to Estonia. I think it's incredibly unfair to call this a racist dog whistle, because this is historically what Stalin did. He didn't so much force anyone to immigrate to Estonia, rather he subsidized and loyalists to go to Estonia in order to integrate into Estonia and break down the culture that was there. This wasn't a matter of race. This was a matter of culture that was important. It destroyed the culture there, and it allowed for Stalinism to take root in Estonia. That's why Estonia ultimately fell to the Soviets. So I'm not saying, I don't find it fair to call this a racist dog whistle or an appeal to the alt-right. And the reason why this can be applied to the modern world and the modern policy that we have in the United States is because there is a subsidization of immigration right now. And I'm not saying that they are directly paying you to go to state, be blatantly false on my end, but subsidies can come in other means, such as that of we are going to reduce the cost for ways to do that is to have a society in which relation is relatively unrestricted, in which you can come in here if you go through this process. In a private law society, there wouldn't be this open border here that is subsidizing immigration. This would be up to private landowners to decide who passes through, who comes in here, who comes out of here. It is the decider of the owners of that. But when the state holds a border and keeps it open, they're also committing aggression in the same way that a state restricting immigration would. It is just a simple, respond to that?
Oh, go ahead and finish. And then I'm sorry,
Okay.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're totally fine. The reason why is because whether borders be open or closed in the modern society, what's important to consider is who owns it. The state owns the land, and with that in mind, we can see that it's an illegitimate ownership. It is stolen land no matter what. And with that in mind, the goal shouldn't be to argue over whether or not borders should be open or closed. We should be taking an action toward privatization, such as decentralizing it. One of the ways that I've suggested this is to invoke the 10th Amendment. Nowhere in the Constitution is it legal for the federal government to restrict immigration. So why not allow the states to have their own immigration policies? Let's make it to where if New Mexico wants to allow anyone in, they can do so. And the reason why this would be so much better is because we have a localized system of government, meaning that the victims of taxation have a greater say over the land that they are being forced to subsidize. That's what I'm trying to say here, is that we should make an aim for decentralizing.
Yeah,
All right,
lot of good. Oh, go ahead.
Before you respond, Dr. Varner, you were making a point before your connection dropped. I would like to give you the opportunity to finish that thought and then to respond to.
Yeah, my thought was simply that paragraph was there in a modern context to make reference to the idea that we're losing our culture to Mexicans, and I find that a particularly objectionable part of modern political discourse. But I think the more interesting point here is that we don't disagree. TJ and I don't disagree a lot on the idea of privatized borders. But I would just point out that there are probably on the border 150,000 individual landowners, and I think that the market clearing price for the right to cross it in a free society would be quite low as a result of that. Evidence of that would be, for example, the fact that nobody checks immigration papers at the shopping mall. You can walk into the shopping mall, it's private property, and nobody cares where you're from, and nor would anybody care. But there's a concept in common law called why am I drawing a blank now? An easement of necessity. Easement of necessity. And basically what it says is if you have a piece of land and it's surrounded by somebody else's land, then you have the right to pass through their land. You have to do it unobtrusively, but they can't simply landlock you and either put you as a prisoner on your own land or keep you out of your land. And this applies actually to the state's borders. So, and I would just say that the pertinent question when we're talking about immigration today is how many immigration visas will be issued? How many people will be kidnapped by the state and sent abroad? How many people will be permitted to come to the United States as tourists? These are the pertinent questions because these are the political reality dictates that this is where things can get better or worse. And so I would argue that when the state says, we will not permit this certain class of people to cross the border, we will say they are ineligible for employment in the United States, that as a property owner here, they're violating my rights. If I want to hire someone who passport, it says I may not right as much as someone else's. So I would say that it's incumbent upon us, if we're working in the political process as it is, that we must fight for open borders. And what I mean by open borders is people who want to come here peacefully, who are not known troublemakers, should be allowed to do so.
Okay. Anything? Am I good to go?
Yeah, go ahead. If you have
Okay,
a response,
awesome.
go ahead.
Sorry, I'm used to more formalized debate style, so I'm more used to like adjudicators acknowledging.
This
but
is just a free flow of conversation.
No, absolutely. So I actually am glad that we're finding some common ground here, that privatization is the end goal. And Dr. Varner, I would agree with you in the context that if you wish to hire someone and have them come to your land, it is not within the state's right to stop you. I completely and totally agree with you there, actually. And I would argue that Lew Rockwell would as well. The main reason why I would say that is because in this article on open borders, he talks about the notion of invitation. I'm going to have to find this. This is what Lew Rockwell has to say on this notion here. So just gotta find it real quick. Murray wondered, does libertarianism require me to support this, much less to celebrate it? Or might there be on the immigration question after all? And here Murray posed the problem just as I have. In a fully private property society, people would have to be invited onto whatever property they traveled through or settled on. If every piece of land this is Murray Rothbard, by the way, if every piece of land in a country were owned by some person, corporation, or group, this would mean that no person could enter unless invited to enter and allowed to rent or purchase property. A totally privatized country would be as closed as the particular property owner's desire. It seems clear then that the regime of open borders that exists de facto in the US and Western Europe really amounts to a compulsory opening by the central state. The state in charge of all streets and public land areas does not genuinely reflect the wishes of the proprietors. So with this, we can take Rothbard's quotation here to say that you need invitation, and that is Rockwell's position as well. That's also Hans Hermann Hoppe's position. So one of the things is that we're looking into trying to mix our personal preferences, political theory here. I actually agree, Dr. Varner, that in a fully privatized society, immigration would be much easier than it is right now. I'm not going to speak upon Lew Rockwell's behalf because I don't know the answer to that, but he understands economics quite well. I would say that he would see that as well, because one of the points is this: Lew Rockwell has never really put his foot down on a cultural issue. If anything, he has fought for his right. I fought for the right of people to live as they see fit. One of the ways to do is to look into Jeff Dice's quotation on this pertaining to Lew. I'm always puzzled when Lew is attacked as a quote-unquote right-winger, especially by libertarians. This is a charge made by those who insist on attaching a left cultural component onto political libertarianism, and thus find Lew's commitment to his Catholic faith and the natural rights tradition suspicious, if not disqualifying. But political is about state power, not extra libertarian cultural preferences. Lew's America would allow any and all voluntary social arrangements. That he would not endorse all of them is beside the point. So what's important to realize is that when Rockwell says here that a society would be as closed as the proprietors want it to be, he's also saying it would be as open as the proprietors want it to be. So this is the point of, take Ludwig von Mises's radical decentralization. That is what we're aiming for here. This is basically saying that when we are looking in the context of the United States, there is not a proper answer because there's so many parts of the US. I would attest to the idea that Kentucky is an entirely different nation from California. There's so many differences in that context. So with that in mind, it's better to focus our energy not on having open borders or closed borders, but on having the system of decentralization.
Mm-hmm.
We can oppose laws that unjustly restrict the movement of other individuals, such as deportations, visas that you have to have in order to get someone onto United States soil. All of those things are things that I am against. Those are all things that I believe Lew Rockwell would be against as well, based off of his belief in an invitation system. So
real quick, I do want to give Dr. Varner an opportunity to respond, and then we have an
Certainly.
audience question right
All right.
after.
Well,
Dr. Berto, if you want to respond, and then afterwards,
sure.
we have time
Yeah.
for
So
questions.
I mean, the idea of an invitation system, people reveal their preferences by their actions. That's a kind of an axiom of Austrian economics, and I think we see right now that people that there is kind of a general preference for more commerce. And what I mean by that is that there are a few states, for example, that require landlords to check the legal status of their renters, but by and large, undocumented immigrants don't have trouble renting land. They don't have trouble going to the grocery store. They don't have trouble going to the shopping mall. And they also don't have trouble finding people willing to employ them. For example, we right now, due to immigration crackdowns, are having people not able to harvest their crops, and tomatoes rotting on the vines in California, even Alabama, especially some state level things. But radical decentralization, which is something overall I favor, but I favor it as an eventual goal. But we have to keep in mind that the enforced open borders that happens between the states in the United States has some real benefits for the United States as a whole. That is to say that we have free trade throughout this entire gigantic territory, and it means that the comparative advantage of one place and the other place can be having this kind of interchange. But what it also means is that some states are restricted from enacting horrible welfare schemes. And I'm thinking specifically of Vermont and California, which have populations that largely favor government health care and have politicians who routinely espouse the idea that they're going to create a state-sponsored single-payer healthcare scheme. And I would submit to you that that is extremely unlikely to ever happen in Vermont or California as long as they have open borders. Because if they were to create a Medicare for all funded by taxes in Vermont, what would happen is every person with a dime to their name would leave the state of Vermont, and every person with some kind of an ailment would enter the state of Vermont. That system would collapse along with the political career of every politician who backed it. And so the open borders, in this case, are protecting California and protecting Vermont from the socialist impulses of their residents. And so it raises a question about the idea of radical decentralization, that when you decentralize something in this way, and you say, okay, the states are going to be able to set their own immigration policies. Hey, I love that if one state can allow people in. Like, for example, in Europe, Spain has been issuing Schengen visas to a lot of people who wouldn't get them from other parts of Europe. I like that part, but the idea that you could also have that you could go to the other direction and say, hey, now this state's going to keep these people out, and now all of a sudden you have a trade war between California and Arkansas. That's a very problematic thing, and it's something. And I'm not saying that it's a reason to reject something with which we have to grapple.
Okay, so I want to get to an audience question real quick.
Yeah, certainly. So we'll go ahead and ask the first question from the comments here. This one's going to go to TJ first. So we're libertarians, so looking for free market solutions. But what do you think of the idea of selling off green cards or visas to the highest bidder? Do you see that as a potential solution or workaround at all?
Sure, if that would be a reasonable way to restrict immigration, because this is just, in a sense, giving money to the state in order to say you can come in. A better way than this would be to say, if you have an employer willing to sponsor your passage into the U.S., and I feel that would be a much more reasonable way. Short of that, I think a merit system would be better, because wealth isn't the only measurement of how good you are. I think that assuming we have, I would prefer to keep the one that we have right now than to just sell it off to the highest bidder, because that would just put it into a wealth system. And we don't know how these individuals got their wealth. It could be that they got it through corporate subsidies within their prior nation. It could be through so many unethical means. I merit would be far better, and I even think the status quo would be better than what it is right now.
Okay, so I'm going to ask another audience question. This one, since the last one went to TJ, I'll ask this to you, Dr. Varner. This one was from TJ Frederick, who asked in our post before the podcast started, he asked, why do some people believe that covenant communities are not an acceptable compromise in the debate over borders. That is, why must the state regulate the borders instead of a voluntary private sector solution?
Look, I favor a voluntary private sector solution. I'm an anarcho-capitalist, and I don't believe in the concept of government. But I also recognize that this is my philosophical position. It is not shared by 99% of the world. And so if I'm going to have any impact on immigration, it's going to be through the political process. And as I said, the questions that I can have some kind of an impact on are how many green cards get issued. How are those issued? How vigorously are laws against undocumented immigrants enforced? Or how zealously do they kidnap people? Would be a better way of describing that. So those are the things I can have influence on. And so I would direct my political activity towards encouraging more green cards and more visas to be issued, encouraging visa-free travel, and shaming and discouraging the kidnapping of undocumented people.
Okay, so this is I guess I'll ask this to TJ. It was a criticism of the article that Lew wrote specifically. It seems to me that the biggest concern that Lew Rockwell had in his article wasn't so much the concept of open borders, but the fact that other government policies combined with open borders force an infringement upon private property, such as anti-discrimination laws, for example, or welfare laws, stuff of that nature. So I guess my main, criticism of the article is it's really actually kind of irrelevant. If the problem is that open borders combined with these other policies are an infringement on private property, shouldn't the main focus be opposing those other policies, of course, anti-discrimination laws, for example? Shouldn't the main focus be on opposing those as opposed to open borders?
Okay. So basically, I'm going to summarize your, and then I'm going to explain why I think it just slightly falls short. The summary is just in case I'm misunderstanding it. So the summary is that the concept of open borders is not the problem, but the problem is the other laws that come with it, such as the welfare state and anti-discrimination laws. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
It's shown that open borders would be perfectly fine. It's just that these other policies combined with it create a troublesome situation, I guess.
Okay. Absolutely. So one of the things that is implicit, anytime Lew Rockwell or Hans Hoppe bring in the concept of open borders, they are talking about in a statist apparatus. Okay, so that is the reason why it is important to look to it as open borders as well, because so long as a state exists, government ownership of borders is a problem. It is so in essence, how does the government gain the land for its borders? Well, either it is unowned land, at which point the government is tending to it with stolen property, or it was owned by someone beforehand, at which point they took it through eminent domain. Either way, that is wrong. If the government seizes a plot of land and says that it must stay open, that is an infringement upon the rights of the owner of that land just before the government seized it. So that is why it is important to look into this and actually critically analyze the concept of open state borders. That's generally what I will, so people understand what I'm saying whenever I talk about open borders, I'll say open state borders.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Between a border and a government-run border and a government-run road?
I'm sorry?
A government-run border and a government-run road. What's the difference in terms of like your objections to them? Are there additional objections to a government-run border above and beyond a government-run highway?
Honestly, no. I see both of them as infringements of the government using it. I think both of them lead to a tragedy of the commons, and I believe that they are all by the stolen tax dollars of other Americans.
Okay.
So I don't see much of a difference between the two, actually, because as far as I'm concerned, it's stolen land that ought to be returned to its owners or to those who have been forced to tend to it. I'm not particularly a cultural warrior. You'll have one of the things that's unfortunate is that because I'm anti-open state borders, I get lumped in with the restricted immigration types, as in like use the state to restrict immigration, which I'm 100% against, mind you. And you'll get those people who go in and say like, oh yeah, we have to restrict immigration to preserve the white race. Well, I really don't care what race wins out. I don't care what race survives. Genotypically speaking, race doesn't even exist. But the thing is, like, it's such an irrelevant issue to me because the United States military is currently committing genocide in Yemen right now. You want to talk about an issue that should matter to people? It's an issue that should matter. It shouldn't be some cultural issue. So that's the thing. I don't really like bringing in culture whenever it comes to this, unless we're talking about a state deliberately destroying a culture. At which point I'm against, because that is a government ending something that is, which in my opinion would be a culture. Does that sort of answer your question?
It does, and then but it raises more questions for me, because whenever the issue of immigration comes up, it seems to me like people from your side of this debate who agree with you on these things always bring up this idea of open state borders in the context about things like how many human beings should be kidnapped and sent abroad, or how many immigration visas should be issued. And it seems to me like they're two entirely separate issues. And if the one is brought up in the context of the other, that seems to me to be bad faith argument.
Okay, well, that's one of the things is, like, as I mentioned, like I'm lumped in with these people because of my opposition to state borders. But the issue is that I'm not of that variety. I just see the criticism as coming from the fact that it is state ownership of borders. I mean, do they have different consequences? Yes. With roads, you'll have around 40,000 deaths per year. With open state borders, you wind up with a subsidized welfare state, which honestly, it sort of evens itself out whenever you look into tax contributions by immigrants. But the thing is that the root issue is the same. It is that it is government ownership of this land that we have to end. So that, and as far as I'm, the same issue.
Why do you say that a state ownership of borders leads to a welfare state? Is that your contention, that it is actually that there's a causal relationship between the existence of a welfare state and state borders?
No, not at all. I don't believe there's a causal relationship between the welfare state and borders. I believe that immigration situations can be different no matter what. I believe they exist independently of each other. What I do believe, however, is that open state borders can lead to an incentive structure remodeling if you have a welfare state. So, like, you have Milton Friedman's criticism of you can't have open borders without a welfare state. I actually disagree with that, because I think you can have a successful society with it. Whether it's a free society is another question.
What do you think about the proposition? I would argue that open borders restrict a welfare state, and that when you allow anybody to immigrate, what that in essence does is it creates a limit on the generosity of the welfare state for two reasons. Number one, because the population becomes more heterogeneous. We know from a lot of political science that a more heterogeneous population is less likely to vote for benefits. But number two, you just if you have the inability to restrict the people coming across the border, you have to have a limit to the generosity, or you will attract too many people and the system will fail. So you have two kind of bulwarks against a welfare state built in if you enshrine open borders into the Constitution.
One of the reasons why I addressed both of here, the first point, heterogeneous society. What?
I just didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the reason why I take issue to your idea that society becomes more heterogeneous, I'm not saying it doesn't, but the question is whether or not that's a good thing. I think that we can look to heterogeneity on two aspects. We can look to heterogeneity within a community, and we can look at heterogeneity out among communities. So within a community, I would say that heterogeneity is a problem for one of the reasons that you brought in, which is that generosity declines. I actually believe that a generous society is beneficial to a libertarian society. Robert Nisbet wrote in his book, The Quest for Community, that it's important to consider the fact that the family, the community, the neighborhood, those were all defenses against big government till government intertwined itself in there and people became more and more heterogeneous. Now, on the society of looking at heterogeneity among civilizations, I think that's a good thing to say that there's a diverse collection of civilizations. I'll just use an example that we have with Kentucky. We have Rabbit Hash, Kentucky, a small town, this town that I was born and raised in. There were 600 people there last I checked, compared to Lexington, where there's about 1 million people, where it's very different cultures, very different contexts. I think that's a good thing to have, because that way it becomes more easy for people to vote with their footsteps. Assuming we live in a statist society, we should have a greater diversity of states that allow people to sort of live within their preferences. Because one of the theories, and this is one of the points that I was actually going to bring in whenever you're talking about how with decentralization, you can move toward the other direction of a more restrictive society, which is why I was going to bring in the point of who is the owner of this land or these resources that the state has taken. And I would say that is the victims of taxation, or the people who had this stuff directly stolen from them. Those are the people that own it. In my personal opinion, they should be able to drive those resources in the direction that they prefer, short of total privatization. So that's the reason why I would say that limit welfare. But the question is, so moving on to your second point on the limitations of welfare, it can if you have an extremely fast-moving policy-making society. So the problem with America is that it takes way too long to change. Imagine a libertarian saying that. But whenever we're talking about this, so suppose you are right and there is a bunch of people flooding into a society and they realize that they need two policies because of that. Well, you have to go through both houses of Congress. You're going to have to go through special interest to get the votes to be that way. Then you're going to have to go to the governor or the president, depending on which level of government you're at. And then you might wind up with challenges in court. You might have a judge delay the effect. Drastic consequences in the meantime. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it answers my question. I definitely disagree with the kind of the conclusion, but it answers the question.
Sure.
What this fundamentally comes down to, I think, is we don't have a lot of disagreement except over philosophical minutia. And I wish that in the libertarian movement we didn't fight as much over this. And I mean, I'm very guilty for having fought over this. But we have a lot of people in the libertarian movement who have, or I don't even know if I would call them the libertarian movement, who have gone off the deep end. I would cite Stefan Molyneux as one, Wayne Allen Root as one. These people who have decided that for one reason or another, they may be libertarians, or in Molyneux's case, anarcho-capitalists, but they love the state when it comes down to it. And these people really infuriate me, and I'm not sure, and they infuriate people, because when I apologized on Facebook about what I said, after apologizing, and half the people said, "Damn you, don't apologize, you were right." And so what are we to do about this division in the libertarian movement?
Okay.
This is a question that all libertarians have wrestled with at one point or another. But I think Mike has a question he wants to ask.
Yeah. So Dr. Varner, kind of going back to the issue of culture here, outside of our libertarian echo chambers, culture's important to a lot of folks. And I'm kind of looking at the history of immigration. Our government policy on immigration has basically had a history of racism. When you look at how we've handled the Irish, Japanese, Chinese, how we're currently handling, everything south of the border. But over the last couple of weeks, I've visited various towns here in Nebraska that have been directly affected by our immigration policy. One basically embraced, immigration and bringing in a new plant, and that town is thriving. One is currently fighting against the policy and the bringing in a new plant, and they're kind of struggling at the moment. And their big reason is because they felt like their culture, they were going to be losing parts of their culture. So
taco trucks on every corner.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
how do we be that effective? How do we have that effective conversation with immigration policy with some of these folks when we have our philosophical ideas, but these are people that are living it day to day, and they're showing much more concern about a place that they've lived for, their family's been for 3 or 4 generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's hard because you have to approach these people respectfully, even though that sentiment that my culture is inherently superior and the government should use violence in order to protect my culture from any kind of competition is a really odious sentiment. But I've often thought, because I spend at least sometimes every month, and I've often thought that if more people traveled abroad and saw other cultures and other people, that they would quickly come to appreciate that every place you go has something really unique to offer, and that there's not really a threat in living together in commerce. There's no threat to having more people to do business with and trade with. So I would say that we need a more interconnected world, and that a lot of those people who are afraid that there's going to be a taco truck on every corner are the same people who have not ever seen the world. And so I would say to these people, come on, go on a trip abroad and see what the world is like.
And another thing to say about that is when different people of different cultures migrate to other countries, it's usually not the kind of, like, what do you see in like a lot of big cities? You see different immigrant communities conglomerating into specific locations. It's not a widely, it is to a certain degree dispersed, but many times it's condensed into small areas. So instead of having a wide dispersal of people coming in and interacting with society as a whole, what you get are little enclaves of different culture, different cultural places.
Yeah.
Here in Nebraska, we have Czech enclaves, we have Croatian enclaves, German enclaves. You have Chinatowns all over the country. You have German communities out in
German and Russian.
Yeah, you got different enclaves all over the place.
Redneck culture is Scottish.
Yeah, you got Scots who influence us a great deal. So I think the fear over one culture taking over another and replacing it is, I understand why people worry about that. They don't want to see the place that they've lived their entire lives dramatically change to what they don't recognize. But I think the fear is largely misguided, because what you end up really getting is just enclaves of different cultures that you get to experience and interact with, and that just furthers people being able to understand each other.
But the real problem with the fear of the change is because they feel like they don't have any input on the change. There's people moving in, there's things changing, and this is something that's not being voted on. This isn't something that is being decided by an HOA or committee or anything like this. It just seems to them it's just something that's happening without any type of voice from them, from the people who are in these communities. So that's where that fear of the culture change comes from.
Yeah, I was just in Singapore, And one of the really cool things about Singapore is just how many different ethnic little areas there are there. So I stayed at a hotel in Little India, and then the conference organizers took me to this place that was basically Little Thailand. And there's just every little country has its own neighborhood. And then you walk down the street in Little India of Singapore, and you could swear you're in India. They have gold shops and Indian food shops, and that's really amazing to me. And then, people will be able to have so many different commercial experiences as a result of that it makes the quality of life for everyone there higher, I think. And, I think for a country like Singapore specifically, their very liberal immigration policies are absolutely a huge contributing factor to their tremendous economic success that they've had, although they've over the last decade or so. That's been a huge part of it. And yeah, you have to let go of this idea that you can control the way the world develops. You can't.
Okay, we have a viewer question. You want to ask this one, Mike?
Oh yeah. So another viewer question is: do you think that open borders would improve or worsen the current healthcare crisis?
And we'll let TJ answer that one first, since you haven't spoken about it.
I don't think you could really make the healthcare crisis in America much worse unless you go to a full single payer system. I don't see how immigration would really make this one worse. Honestly, I feel like the two would be largely separate, because I know that it's the ACA is largely something for citizens, and the thing is that it's been overridden as is. We have too many people on that system as is, and it's really hard to make it worse at this point. So I'm not a healthcare guy. That's not my area, especially that's much more of a Dr. Varner question. I would just say I don't know, in the context of I'm just not a medical person.
Well, the state is. Well, the state is insidious, and the state's tentacles in terms of healthcare extend far, and immigration extend far beyond controls at the border. And so the answer to this could be one or the other, because I see as a major problem in U.S. healthcare the fact that doctors and other healthcare providers are scarce. But the thing is that there are plenty of qualified doctors and healthcare providers who want to immigrate to the United States, and either can't do it because they can't get the visa, or can't do it because this is very interesting. If you are the top neurosurgeon in the United Kingdom, you would have to go repeat your training in an American residency program in order to get a license to practice in America. No reason for that. No, absolutely no good reason for that. But so what I'm saying is open borders in a world where we actually allow people to practice their trades would be a tremendous boon. And yes, if we just allow, like, if we open the borders, but we tell people you can't practice the trade you're qualified to practice in, then what we do is we increase the demand for medical services without a commensurate increase in the supply, and then we do worsen the current problems. So this actually, there was a big issue back during the pre-World War II and mid-World War II era, because a lot of Jewish physicians were entering the United States, and the AMA was actually trying to keep them out of medical practice. So as anti-Semitism was rising in Europe, the Jews were in Europe, the AMA was trying to say, no, you may not practice your profession here unless you do this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of those things have kind of stuck around, and that's kind of the genesis of this whole idea that we're going to make you do a residency program in the US, even if you're the top heart surgeon in France. You're not good enough to practice in the US. So the state has a lot of tentacles, and there are a lot of very toxic tentacles.
All right, so we are pushing up against our time here, but since we got into the topic of healthcare, I thought this would be a good time for Dr. Varner to plug his new book, his new website, and whatever else anything else you have coming up or you would like our audience to know about.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Healthcare in the United States is extremely expensive, and it's expensive because it is a cartel. It's a system of government-enforced scarcity designed to benefit market incumbents, and patients are paying the price. So my upcoming book, White Coat Cartels, is an expose on this issue, and it's also a how-to guide to break free from this and get high-quality, low-cost healthcare using tools like tourism and you can sign up for my newsletter at drvarner.com, and you can definitely be the first to know about my book when it comes out in 4 to 5 months.
Awesome. That's very cool. So I'll give this opportunity now to TJ to plug anything you have that you want our audience to know about, including your upcoming book.
Sure. Is this sort of like a final statement kind of thing?
Yeah. Because
Awesome.
we only got like a few minutes left in the.
Okay, perfect. Because I do have one thing that I do want to say. But first of all, make sure you be on the lookout. I am dropping a new book here soon. It's called Freedom First, is what it's called. All you have to do to get the ebook version of it for free is just be on my email list. That's all it takes. It's my first book. So, but one of the things I think is important to realize is this: my anger in this situation didn't come from the immigration debate. What had me infuriated was the idea of the attacks on Lew Rockwell, which I'm very thankful for Dr. Varner for apologizing for. But I'm here to just point the fact out that Lew Rockwell is a hero. The man has been anti-war his entire life. Very few people know this, but his older brother was killed in World War II. From there, his family was always anti-war. His family even played a role in opposing the horrific Vietnam War. I mean, everyone labeled as an unpatriotic conservative by the oh so brilliant voices at National Review. So that's one of the issues here. He has taken a charge against the state on both the left and the right. This is especially exemplified in his article, "The Reality of Red State Fascism." But above all else, he's been a progenitor of every. Think of these institutes when you think about him: the American Institute for Economic Research, Campaign for Liberty, Cato, George Mason University, Grove City College, Hillsdale College, the Independent Institute, the Institute for Humane Studies, Libertas Institute, Loyola Universities, the Mercatus Center, the Mises Institute, which is incredibly important to now, the Property and Freedom Society, the Ron Paul Institute, Students for Liberty, and Young Americans for Liberty, just to name a few. But one of the things that's important to realize is that the Mises Institute isn't just Lew Rockwell involved with it, along with Margit von Mises, Ludwig von Mises' wife. She was, in fact, on the board of trustees until the day she died in 1993. One of the things to consider about Lew Rockwell is who gave him his start. Ron Paul hired him not just off of some whim, but under the advisement of Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education. So Lew Rockwell's reach goes very far, and is Robert Higgs and Ron Paul. So with that in mind, I'd like to close with that and say that we need to remember what Lew Rockwell has said and consider that one disagreement with him is not enough to just discredit him as a villain to the cause of liberty.
All right, I'll let Dr. Varner have the final word then.
Well, I would tend to agree with you. I think Lew Rockwell has done some very important things for liberty. I would say that there are problems with things that he's done in the past, but no human being is perfect, and overall, the cause of liberty is better off for him. And I should never expect a human being to be exactly what I want them at every moment of everything. And I hope going forward we can have more unity in the libertarian movement, because ultimately, when it comes down to specific policy questions, we don't have a lot to disagree on.
Awesome.
I agree.
Well, remember, even the great Murray Rothbard said that every libertarian is allowed one deviation. So we all need to be, to a certain degree, a little forgiving of one another's faults, because nobody's the perfect libertarian. Someday, libertarian Jesus will come down from heaven and show us all the path of righteousness. But until
Isn't
then,
that Zach?
no, he's Scottish. He doesn't count.
I thought libertarian Jesus is named Larry Sharp.
That's close.
The jury's out on that, but he's surely making the case. So I just want to thank both of you for coming on this podcast, after a heated week and a heated conversation that was going on online, sitting down with each other, having a respectful, intellectual discussion about this very important issue. So thank you guys so much for agreeing to come on here.
Yes, thank you very much.
And we hope
All right,
to see
wonderful.
both of you again on this podcast sometime in the future.
Well,
Thank you.